Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming on to our production allocation webinar. This will be one of the only webinars we ever use PowerPoint for, so not a live demo or anything like that. But we'll be able to dive in deep and show you some of the steps we roll through in allocating production. While we were putting this together, we did a lot of research around how production has been historically allocated and kind of dug into all of the issues that people are used to seeing. But what we'll run through here and what you'll see is just the kind of depth of steps that we take to address this problem. Something that we're very proud of what we've come through, and hopefully you'll appreciate and check it out. We have a full deck here to go through, so we're going to go ahead and get started right away. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for some questions and Q&A at the end. If you want to, anytime during the webinar, drop your questions in the question section and we'll be happy to help. And then we will put this presentation, we'll make it available as a handout here. We'll also share a few links with some searches, and this recording will be available to download anytime after we're over here. So just to dive right in, overview, the problem. Texas reports production at a lease level. Most people on this webinar are already aware of this. Goal is to obviously get it to a well level, and to do so, we have to allocate the well to the lease level data down to the well. What is a lease? It's a grouping of wells. It can be anything. They're not really rhyme or reason necessarily to how the wells are put in place. Sometimes all the wells in a lease are part of a pad. Sometimes they're not. There are 3 different types of leases as far as the Texas Railroad Commission is concerned. One is a gas lease. Gas leases are only one well leases, are really not a problem we have to address with the allocation procedures. The other types are both oil well leases, but they're broken into 2 different groups. There's the standard oil lease, which has allowables that are actually generated on every well, and test data is required on every well for those. So there'll be allowables both at the well level and at the lease level. But then there's the idea of a multi-well lease, and these are older leases, and then Yatesfield is a good one. And those don't require a allowable at the well level. The allowables are only defined at the lease level, and the data is older and honestly is just a little bit more fuzzy, typically large leases as well. So we address all of them in the same manner because they kind of fall in the same ballpark for us, and we only differentiate on the amount of data available. Here's a couple examples of leases just to kind of show you the randomness of it. I think this is the Alito A lease. This is the Alito B lease in LaSalle County. And this is the Mussenberger, I think it is. But as you can see, you can't really devise any information about the proximity of the wells. You know they're in the same general area typically, but they don't have to be related in any other way. So it's important to note that you can't necessarily determine that the movement and production on one well is directly affected by the other wells in the lease, because there may be zero interference, because they may be thousands of feet apart, if not miles apart. So why does it matter at all? Okay, so in WellDatabase, we make it a point to allocate everything to the well level and to the month level. That's important because we allow you to do comparisons of data across state borders and any types of wells in any vintage. And so we have to get this down to the well level to do that in our system. The other thing is by month, in some areas actually report quarterly or annually, and we address those problems differently as well. But at the end of the day, what you get is a by month, by well production. And this is super important because all of the drilling, all the permitting, the completions, it's all done at the well level. And if you want to understand the effects of the process of the drilling and completing a well and how it affects production, then you really have to break it down to the well level. And beyond that, forecasting obviously needs to be done at a well level. You can't really forecast out at least in an effective manner to understand what the future production is going to look like. Our process is broken up into a few parts we'll run through. So we set up the data, and that includes well data, the pending lease production data, test data, and monthly volumes. We go through a step of cleaning and adjusting the data so that it can be primed for the allocation. And then we run the allocation procedure, which runs of several different types of methods that we'll cover here. So first, well data, pretty straightforward. We get the API numbers, or well identifier, so that we can kind of carry that along through the process. We establish the completion date, the completion type, whether that's a oil completion, a gas completion, injection, or disposals. We want to keep track of all that type of information, because on wells will be reported on a lease that are injection wells, and you just have to make sure you're not accounting for the production in those areas. And then while we're at it, we capture the completion formation and the operator so that we can run analytics based off of that data in the future. And it's important to also grab the plug dates, which are in a complete different area of the Railroad Commission, but you have to get the plug dates because, especially in older leases, wells get plugged up and you need to make sure that you cut off the production and allow the other ones to go. Pretty basic information, but there's actually coming from 3 different places from the Railroad Commission. Pending lease data is a unique database that the Railroad Commission has that basically they require operators to report all the production out of the well. And so during a period in a new well, if it has not yet been assigned to a lease, they still require the production to be reported, but it goes into a pending lease set. Now that pending lease set is based off of API numbers or drilling permit numbers, and it's at a well level. So it's a great way to get some hard well information, and one of the few places to get it. But once a lease is assigned, all future data will be reported at the lease level, and it won't be reported to the pending lease anymore. And then the pending lease report will retain that reported information for the months in which it was on the pending lease. But then the data is supposed to be rolled into the lease level data at the time when it is assigned. It's a great way. It's one of the only ways to get well level production data for lease wells, but it requires a data validation. The operator is required to roll the data into the lease or notify the Railroad Commission to remove the pending lease records from the pending lease set. And there are fields and flags that we use to identify the process and where they're at. And the status should be updated when the data is incorporated in the lease, but it isn't always. That's a huge problem, because one of our biggest goals we have when allocating is that double counting is a complete no-no. That's impossible. We can't do that. And so we have to know, is the data incorporated into the lease numbers, or is it in addition to the lease numbers? From the Railroad Commission, this was a line on their site. They had a deduplication effort they ran, and the numbers were a little scary. 58% of the pending production count and 69% of the liquid and 56% of the gas volumes were actually duplicated. And so they cleaned it up a lot, but I will tell you from my experience with that set that there is still plenty of duplication in there, and there is still plenty of overstating. So it's something that is very important to account for whenever you're doing allocation and utilizing that pending lease data. The next thing we get is the test data. It's a great piece, and one of our competitors exclusively uses the test data for their allocation. We use it as one of the multiple methods we can take, but it is one of the only hard data points you get in the life of the well. In Texas, lease wells required to test at least once a year or more. If you're looking to reallocate production or reset your allowables, you may test a well in between your annual tests as well. So it's important for us. The number of test points are really important to us, because that allows us to create our model based off of it. And so the time period in which the tests take place doesn't really matter to us as much as the number of test points. And I'll show you that here in a second about how we utilize that. But allowables are generated from the test data, and the test data relationship, what we found, and I think we have 8 million test points in our system, is that the relationship between the test data and the production data is inconsistent when applied from multiple wells. So you can't say that if a well tested at X amount of barrels per day, that relates to a certain production number for that month. And that could be related to a few different potential issues. The test procedures, while standardized and you have to be certified to run those tests, the procedures aren't exactly the same. And also there are some kind of common effects that people are aware of test data is being inflated for great IP numbers, good headlines, and stuff like that. But what we did find is that our test data relationship to the production was consistent throughout the lifetime of a well. So the procedure used to test a well seems to fall in line as the life of the well moves forward. So that means as a relational point within a single well life, it's a good a good data point to use. You just don't want to say it's apples to apples when comparing two different wells. And the last thing we get is the monthly volume, so lease level numbers. And from the Railroad Commission, it's good to point out here that the lag, you basically have 30 days to file your production report, and so you don't get the production numbers in this example here for July are due at the end of August, and then they get loaded into the Railroad Commission database and made available for 2 to 3 weeks after that. So mid-month, so last in March, we loaded January's data. So that's just an example. And here in the next week, we'll probably, or in a week or two, we'll load in February's data. The other thing to note in this is that the data is routinely revised and corrected over time. And as from the Railroad Commission, it says production are substantially complete after about 6 months. This is important to note too, and then something we take into account in our procedures. It's also why the EIA numbers never match anything, because they are taking estimations for the to help account for the historical, to help account for the variability in the 6 months. But still, it makes it hard to compare, but it's more of an estimate on their side. We still pull allowables, by the way. We previously relied heavily on allowables because they were based on test data and they were reported monthly on wells. But we still use it to help understand when wells are on schedule, but the consistency for the allowable data is not there. We used it, we ran through and allocated our entire database using it, and we found huge inconsistencies and had to back off of it and go another route. So the next step after we have all that data pulled together is we clean and adjust the data. So number one, identify known values. Pending lease values are known. If you have pending lease plus one well that is not in a pending lease, then you simply take the difference and those all become known values. So you have all the pending lease ones that you're aware of plus the addition of the one well. And then any periods where only one well is producing. Those are our only 3 known production values that we work with. The next step is determine the first production date. And to sound simple, and in general, it will be the completion date is when the first production date will be used, but it's not always the case. And we cross-reference the pending lease values and the completion data to try to identify to make sure that the well did indeed come online in the month that it was completed. But there are multiple cases where it does not come online for perhaps the following months or even 2 or 3 months later. But we have a process for identifying that, and it's based on the combination of the pending lease information as well as the completion data that we get from the state that helps us indicate whether the well was completed and started producing, and allowables actually roll into that as well. And then if a well has come online in a new month, we try to identify the number of days it produced during that month, and that's going to help us whenever we go through our allocation to weight those properly. And then now we get to the running allocation. So the allocation obviously is not necessary on gas leases or oil leases with one well. And then finally also any wells that are on the pending report only. And so any given month, you have a handful of wells that are not associated to a lease yet, and so we just take those pending lease data points and drop it straight into and assign us to the well. And each month we'll come back and incorporate the differences to try to make sure that once the well gets onto a lease, then we start incorporating all the procedures around that. Our process always starts at the beginning of the lease. So every time we run our process, we go back to the very beginning of when the lease started. And so that means you get a full historical rework of the lease every month, because we get new data points and it allows us to shift our model and change and try to become more accurate as time progresses. We have a great example of how that works. So many times when we look back at allocations, we look at test data points and model and kind of see as a look back, but we're attempting to do this allocation in real time so that as these wells come online, we're running a process to try to identify what the allocation looks like. And each month we get new data that can change things that have happened in the history. And so it's important that the process always starts at the beginning. And then all of the methods that we run through, we step through month by month, identifying the best method and then applying that to the lease volumes. And you'll see exactly how that works here. And then before we get started on the actual decline of the piece, we do create at the onset a decline model for test data if enough points are available. And what that looks like is we take all the test data points and then we create a decline model off of the test data points alone, kind of in a vacuum. And the goal is not to use those necessarily as hard data points as assign a production for this number based off of the test decline. It's to create a model of the well's decline. And so we do this creating a standard kind of production decline, but we have to modify it so that it falls in line with the spottiness of the data. So for example, this is the test points we have for one of the wells. I forget which one it is, but you can see, you can kind of see how this lays out. You can see how we have test points starting back in 2013 through 2017. And so when we create our decline off of it, that's the decline model we see. And so obviously the test data is bouncing all around the decline model, but it allows us, again, we're modeling it. We're not actually taking these and we're not going to use them as hard values. We're going to use it as a model for weighting the production. So now that we've done those, that's our full setup. We're in the allocation method. So we're going to step through each one of these one by one. And again, if you have any questions, drop them into the questions section in the webinar, and we'll get those at the end here. Hopefully we'll have some extra time for that. So just an overview of what they look like. We have the all known volumes, test decline model method, the production decline method, the production decline +1 method, production decline mix method, and the even divide. And so we will, again, through each iteration through the month of the lease's life, will identify the best method month by month. And so the method will change over the course of the lease, and we'll show you how that works. So all known volumes, we talked about that earlier. If they're all known, whether that be because they're all off the production depending lease or the pending lease +1 or the single well leases, then that's an easy one. We move on to the next period. So we get to the test decline method. The test decline method is only used if all of the wells on the lease have a valid test decline model generated. And so that means not only do they need the model generated, but they have to have a model with valid data over the period that we're looking at. So if we get a well that comes online 1 month and our first test doesn't come in for 3 months after that, then that well is not eligible to use this test decline method until that 3-month period happens and we have a good test decline point. So our model is built and we use it, as a weight, but we also note that the periods that the tests happen have to correlate to the production. So we don't want to be using this test model that was, a test run on a 3rd month of a well. We don't want to use that weight on the 1st month of that well. So, but this is the preferred method because it's one of the more hard points that we can create and one of the more consistent models that we can generate. And as wells life continue on, you get into the 3-4 year period, this is typically what will be used in our system. So what we do, we create that same test decline that we have it for each well. And so this is a 4-well lease. You can see all 4 wells have their test decline and how they kind of vary from well to well. Then we turn that test decline into a percentage. So this is all the weights you can see, and it's kind of a funky look, but this is essentially the month over month, the way that the weights will look for this well. And then we apply those weights to the lease production. So this is what the lease production looks like for this particular lease. And when we apply those weights, this is what we get. And so this is a stacked line. So you can see how this all kind of comes in together. And I turn it into an area so it makes it clear. So, backing up, then when you look at the percentage and weight on this, it does look a little funny how it all moves. But if you look at the decline, you'll notice that, some of these, the way the B values on the decline amounts on the test data are affecting the weights kind of dynamically through. And so this weight is really to show you what our multiplier has done on the lease, but it's not indicative of what the production will look like. So when we apply those weights to the lease level production, this is what you get, and a very clean and consistent answer that gives credence to the test data that we have, but also ensures that volatility, the natural volatility of a lease is accounted for, so that the well production can move up and down, and each well takes it into as a weight to what they do. Yeah, that one being our primary method to use, and it's something that you'll see primarily in the wells that have 2 to 3 years and beyond production, where we have enough test points to do that. The next method is the production decline method. So if all of the wells have enough data points, they can be known data points or they can be calculated. Again, we're running this every month through the life of the lease. And so when now say we've gotten 6 months down through the lease, and each of the wells have enough data points to generate a forecast point, then we'll use this method. So there's minimum of 3 points required. If we have 6, we'll cut off the last point to create a decline. If we have 12, we'll cut off the last 3 points. And we do this kind of that same thing we talked about with Texas, talking about restating their production for several months after the end. And I'll show you here in this next slide how that affects what we do. But we'll use our WellDatabase, our best fit decline method, and we have a blog over that, and we can talk about that in another webinar perhaps. But we have an automated best fit decline that mathematically runs through a range of B values and finds the least R squares, applies that as the application, and forwards it forecast it through. And so we use that decline to generate a forecast point in this case, and then that forecasted data, instead of using it as a hard production value, we convert it into a weight, kind of like we did in the test data. This allows, again, for that volatility, the reality of lease data, the production, that it moves up and down, and you can't just, it's not a pretty decline. It never is. There's some movement in it, and that's okay. But in order to account for that, we turn those values that we have forecasted, which could be considered hard values, but we turn them into weights so that we can account and be flexible with the lease as it moves forward. And so yeah, it'll be applied to the lease value, kind of like the test data was. So here's an example of an existing well that was producing here just recently. This is up to January 19, but you can see how the last month drops off. This is not uncommon to see. And this can be restated several times, as we kind of talked about. Well, if we run the decline model on that, that's the fit we'll get. And that fit does not appear to be, really as clean as it could be. But if we do the thing, follow our process and subtract off the period, then we get a cleaner model that fits better. And so as data comes in, each month comes in, this gets cleaner and cleaner, both by virtue of the Railroad Commission cleaning the data, and as well as the more data points in the decline has more points to hit and gets a more accurate value. So again, it's really important that as time goes, we continually do the entire process so that you can get the most accurate data at any point in time. This is what that lease production looked like. And then whenever we applied this process has been applied to this lease, you can see how all the points line up. So what's happening here is that, like I said, we created that decline model, and we did it on every well active in the period, and then we weighted it, and then we applied that as what the production numbers are for that month. So yeah, the allocation comes out very clean. It allows us to, again, account for volatility in the lease, but also stay true to the established decline of a well. And you can see in this one in early mid 18, we had a big dip in the entire, but we had 3 wells coming online. So it's not uncommon to see whether they were shut in or whether they interferences, those reasons we can't necessarily determine in our process, but we do account for them universally across all the wells. And then you have the new wells online. That's kind of easy to see. The next one is the production decline +1 method. So if all of the wells except a single well have enough data points, again, known or calculated, to create the forecast, and the sum of all of the forecasted points do not exceed the lease production. This is important because if a lease has a significant down month for any reason, and your forecasted data points for all of the active wells on the lease are higher than what the reported production is, then we obviously cannot use those hard values. And that's what the difference between this production decline +1 method is because in this one, we take that same approach we did in the production decline method, except we use the hard values that we decline out. And so the idea is that if we can predict what the next month should be for all known wells, then we can take the difference between the sum of those and the lease level data, and we can attribute that to the +1 well, the one that we didn't know. So you get this a lot when you have an established lease and a new well comes online. And when you get that, it's a pretty clear indication. You basically are predicting each established well what the next month should be, and then taking those and seeing what's left over in the lease and assigning that to the new well that comes online. It actually works excessively well for, again, established leases. It can be tricky whenever you're having new wells come online in, in subsequent months, and that actually will invalidate it from being a candidate for this method, because it requires that all wells except one have enough data points. And we said earlier, 3 points are required in order to create a decline. So yeah, this one is a pretty clean and clear picture that you'll be able to see. And it's a great way to kind of estimate on the fly an allocated value for a new well. And here, as you can kind of see on this particular lease, all the wells were producing, and we had a nice model for allocation going on. And then in around September 13, we had a new well come on, and so we continued that decline. And this is a zoom in of that. We continued the decline of all the current wells, and then we attribute that difference right there to that well. And so it's pretty easy. It makes for a very clean look, and it's pretty logical if you think about it. So it's one of the things that are a little more unique to the way that we allocate this, and it allows us to create an allocated value in the very first month the well comes online. The next method, this is the production decline mix method. And so what we do is happens when we have more than one well that can be declined, along with more than one well that cannot be declined. So 2 wells, 3 wells coming online in the same month, and all the other wells perhaps are established. So it's common, it's very similar to the plus one approach. We take all of the existing wells and we do that forecast point again, but then basically the difference in the +1, we gave it all to that well. Now we just divide the difference up to all of the new wells on the lease. And then we use the days producing that we calculated earlier to help weight the new wells. We don't use initial test data at this point. Many times we don't have it just yet, but even if we do have it, you'll see variances in the days from completion to test. And when you have those, we haven't necessarily assigned a weight to the value of that test point, because it's just variable based off the number of days from when the well went online to when it was tested. So there are some ways and some things we might tweak in there to help pull into the test data to account for what it looks like. But again, making sure everything is doing apples to apples. The test data, point on day 10 of a well versus day 2 of a well can be drastically different. And so taking that into account is kind of why being able to do that is why we don't incorporate that at that time. But it's something we will be adding potentially in the future with some tests and trying to understand the best way to roll that in. And I should here. So this is an example of one where we had 2 wells come on in March of 14, and you can see pretty easily they've been added to the data points there, but you can see that the production numbers are not exactly the same between the 2, and so you can see each one was given its share of the offset, the difference between what we forecasted and what the production was. And then we continue on the method after that. And then the last option we take is an even divide method. And this is the absolute least accurate in our last resort. We basically evenly divide the production amongst all the wells active in the lease at the time. We do give weights to the days producing when we have it, but we do only use this method until enough data points are available to use a different method. And so again, we're doing this month over month, and once we're getting enough data points to create a decline, we'll start using the decline method instead of the even divide. And it allows us, as new wells come online, as old wells drop off, it allows us to stay kind of agile and respond to each of those through our process. The methods over time, this can kind of show you how that happens. So you might have things that start off with an even divide, and then it turns to a test decline method. And that's because all of the wells now have test decline. But then you can see whenever we come into October of 15, we had to change it. We had new wells come online, and so we no longer had test data for that. This one looks like we had multiple wells that came online. And so we had to use the mixed production decline / even divide method for 3 months. And what happened was we then established a decline model for each of those new wells that came online. And then it looks like in January of 16 we had a new well come online as well. And then at February, all of the wells producing were back to having test data. So you can see how our process allows us to account for a varying number of data points throughout the life of a lease. It's just the way it is. It's reality that you never know from month to month what data will be available to you. And so we have to be flexible and shift between the methods based off of the data that's available. Some people will just use test data. And if you do that, then you completely miss the ability to forecast or to allocate production in the early months of a well, and then some of our competitors throw out test data as being inaccurate, which it can be inaccurate, but the models that we generate from our test data have proven to be very accurate. And so we really have found that just a combined approach and the flexibility and being able to shift methods from month to month allow us to just account for a number of scenarios and makes our overall picture both more accurate, it's faster, it's honestly more consistent, and something that can hit more points than most of our competitors can. So there are pitfalls, and I put that in the webinar that we wanted to talk about, the pitfalls that you can run into that, again, some people don't even know. So the pending lease data and the lease level data can contradict each other. It can say, and actually I put the similar one at the bottom there, that identifying cases of status of pending lease production is incorrect. So basically, the pending lease report continues to hold those data points that a well had before it was ever associated to a lease, but then in the future it gets associated to the lease, and that data is supposed to be rolled into the lease. So the question is the data already existing in the lease volumes we get, or is this in addition to the lease volumes we get? And so they have flags that are supposed to help us identify these, but there's been numerous occasions where it's obvious that the lease level data was being reported in the production out in the pending lease report. There are cases where there are double counting, where it is said that it has not been rolled into the lease when it's obvious that it has been rolled into the lease, and vice versa. And so in the complication with that is that depending on the level of production you're looking at, it can be very hard to discern, is this the lease level production or is it a well level production? If you have 1 or 2 wells on a lease that are producing 20,000 barrels per month and a new well comes online at 20,000 barrels per month, you have to make a determination, is this fall in line with the existing, what we know about this lease, or does it fall in line with a new well coming online? And so you can't just use the flags that they have. You have to analyze, you have to look at the history of the lease, and then you have to be able to identify, is this in line with a new well, or is this in line with the existing production from the lease? And that's what we do. And then in allocation, there's always a remainder. So we do a true up at the end of every single period that we allocate. And so in that true up, sometimes you subtract them out, sometimes you add some. It's just the difference whenever you're adding up and rounding kind of thing. And then the number that you're changing will never be more than the number of wells in a lease if you're doing it right, because you're rounding. It's not like you're adding 10s and 20 barrels or something like that. It's just a rounding issue. But it is important. This is something we stumbled onto ourselves, that we were assigning that difference to the largest producer or the lowest producer. We kind of toyed with some of them, but when you do that, it can completely throw off the decline moving forward, especially in lower producing wells. And so that can continually assigning the variance to one well causes a systemic problem across everything you do. And so it's important that you randomly assign those remainders to the wells. Again, we're talking at max one barrel per well or 1 MCF per well. But then also you can avoid assigning the remainder to the same wells in consecutive months. That helps you even out that and retain the ability to decline that, which is necessary for half of our methods that we can use. And then, we have some cases where, new wells come online, or they're marked as online, they're marked as completed, but then the lease number continues to decline. So we have a down month in production with a new well online. Given the lack of any other supporting data, what we found more often than not is that well actually did not come online that month. And most of the time you'll see the next month, the increase in production that can be easily attributed to that new well. So you can't just blindly say when a well is completed, it's producing. You have to come in and you have to see, does a new well make sense within the history of what I know about this lease? And that's what our process does. It goes through and we're declining every well in the lease, and we're looking at the total lease movement. And when a new well comes online, we have expectations of what we should see. It can be as simple as an increase within a variance that we call it's acceptable that a new well came online. But it is important that you identify those cases. You don't just blindly go with what's been said by the state. So we went pretty quick through that. I'm actually pretty proud that we got through that entire thing in 35 minutes. And I know I probably went pretty quick, but at the same time, I hope everybody got a good idea of what we were doing here. And now I'd like to go ahead and jump into some questions here.